Our first bill on the agenda today is Representative Lippert's bill. Representative Lippert, would you care to tell us about your bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. To meet our climate goals as a state, we need to be addressing greenhouse gas emissions across our economy, especially in areas of our economy where emissions have stayed stubbornly flat or slowly increased, like in the transportation sector and agriculture, in our buildings too. This policy will reduce the carbon intensity of fuels, driving the use of cleaner and cleaner fuels, and it will have a broad impact economy-wide. A clean fuels policy like this one is the top recommendation of Minnesota's Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council. According to their report, a clean fuels policy has been demonstrated to increase the use of lower carbon intensity fuels, such as biofuels, electricity as a transportation fuel, and hydrogen. They also point to its ability to attract investment in emerging clean fuels technologies, like aviation biofuel, for example. The goal of this policy is to focus on more than emissions reduction and economic development as well, but also to drive equity in environmental benefits too. The aim of the policy is to support equitable transportation electrification that benefits all communities and is powered primarily with low carbon and carbon-free electricity, to improve air quality and public health, targeting communities that bear a disproportionate health burden from transportation pollution, and also to support voluntary farmer-led efforts to adopt agricultural practices that benefit soil health and water quality while contributing to lower life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from biofuel feedstocks. The coalition behind this legislation is broad, and you'll hear about the many ways that it would benefit Minnesota through the implementation of a clean fuel standard that will reduce the carbon intensity of fuels by 25% by 2035. I'll turn to the first testifier, Brendan Jordan of the Great Plains Institute, to say more about the future fuels policy and how it will work.
Mr. Jordan, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Brendan Jordan. I'm the VP of Transportation and Fuels at the Great Plains Institute, and I'm here to offer my enthusiastic support for House File 2083, Senate File 2027, bipartisan legislation that would establish a clean fuels standard in Minnesota. Why is this an important issue for Minnesota to address? Well, in an era of bipartisan policymaking, under the Pawlenty administration, Minnesota passed landmark legislation, the Next Gen Energy Act, again on a bipartisan basis, to address transportation emissions and petroleum replacement. The statutory goals of 30% petroleum replacement by 2025 and 80% greenhouse gas reduction are not being met today through voluntary goals. I believe policy will be required to get Minnesota back on track in meeting our goals. And the question is really what type of policy can be most effective and lead to the most benefit for Minnesotans. Minnesotans spend over $1 billion a year on liquid fuels for transportation, and that money can be better spent to reduce air pollution, create more innovation and economic benefit for the state, and create more choices for consumers. That's what the Future Fuels Act will help us to achieve. In short, this bill establishes a standard to reduce the carbon intensity of all transportation fuels supplied in the state at least 20% by 2035. It sets up a system to evaluate all transportation fuels based on full life cycle greenhouse gas assessment, not making conclusions about fuels in general, but evaluating the actual performance of individual fuel producers. It sets up a fuel neutral system and allows the private market to compete to offer both value for consumers and the lowest carbon footprint possible. It directs a rulemaking with clear guidance on the objectives that the legislature wants from the program, calls for stakeholder engagement and multi-agency collaboration. I recognize, Mr. Chair and members, this is a somewhat complex piece of policy, which is why we've offered some informational materials as handouts. We have a Clean Fuels Policy 101, members in your packets, also an announcement of the formation of the Future Fuels Coalition, and individual letters of support from a long list of supportive organizations. Why is there so much support for this policy? It's a tested approach and it's growing in popularity. Policies like this have been in existence for over a decade in other jurisdictions, multiple jurisdictions. We know how the programs work. Clean fuel industries are comfortable with them. But no one in the Midwest or in Minnesota would be at all interested, I think, in rubber stamping a program from another state. This is why we have facilitated over 3 years of intense stakeholder dialogue to understand how a program like this could work well for Minnesota and for the Midwest. This led to the announcement of a set of clean fuel policy design principles in January of 2020. Minnesota stakeholder dialogue followed that with leading up to this announcement today, but also a recommendation by the Governor's Council on Biofuels for a clean fuel policy, and as Representative Lippert stated, recommendation from the Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council. This offers many benefits for Minnesota, and I'll wrap up very, very quickly here, but it's an all of the above approach. It doesn't pick technology winners and losers, offers benefits for consumers and more consumer choice, strong economic benefits for the state, as testimony from Jesse Wyatt shortly will illustrate, increases equitable access to transportation, more reliance on Minnesota renewable resources, and I believe would reestablish Minnesota as a leader in the production of cleaner fuels. That concludes my testimony, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jordan. Next, we will be hearing from Tim Sexton with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Mr. Sexton, welcome to the committee.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Long and members, for the opportunity to share some brief testimony today on behalf of the administration. For the record, my name is Tim Sexton, and I serve as an Assistant Commissioner with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. As you all know, transportation is the #1 source of carbon pollution in Minnesota and the United States. And the administration supports the development of a clean fuels policy as an important strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector and meet the goals of the Next Generation Energy Act. A clean fuels policy could reduce carbon pollution from transportation in Minnesota by over 4 million tons by the year 2030 and over 20 million tons by the year 2050. Just for context, 20 million tons would be about half of the total reduction of carbon pollution needed to achieve the state's Next Generation Energy Act goals for the transportation sector. The importance of this policy is reflected in recommendations from the Governor's Council on Biofuels, MnDOT's Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council, and the Governor's Climate Change Subcabinet. The Governor's commitment to pursuing a clean fuels policy is seen in MnDOT's request for funding for a stakeholder process to develop the details of such a policy for Minnesota. Engagement is essential to ensure we hear from as many Minnesotans as possible to design a policy that works best for Minnesota and potentially the Midwest in the future. The proposed stakeholder process should be a multi-agency effort that includes the Departments of Agriculture, Commerce, Transportation, and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, private businesses, nonprofits, academia, and elected officials. MnDOT will continue to work with the bill author and other stakeholders moving forward as the conversation continues around the shared goal of arriving at a clean fuels policy that will reduce health and economic disparities currently experienced by low-income communities and people of color, and prioritize the creation of new markets for the agricultural sector. Thank you for your work on this important policy, and this concludes my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Sexton. Next, we will be hearing from Jesse Wyatt with the Great Plains Institute. Welcome to the committee.
Mr. Chair and members, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Jesse Wyatt. I'm an energy planner and analyst with the Great Plains Institute. And today I will be presenting high-level economic impact findings for a clean fuels policy in Minnesota. So over the past couple of years, as Brendan alluded, GPI, in collaboration with partners, has been convening the Midwest Clean Fuels Stakeholder Initiative. A function of that group was to conduct analysis of carbon reduction standards of 10, 15, and 20%. The result of the 15% reduction standard was then used to conduct further economic impact analysis. We utilized the in-plan economic model, which is a model that has over 500 economic sectors, which it uses to conduct input-output modeling. And we did so for the 2-state region of Minnesota and Iowa. Due to the demand for clean alternative fuels to meet those carbon reductions, we experience increases in production, increased expenditures, and lower cost alternative fuels, all of which contribute to positive economic benefits across the 7 dimensions that in-plan models. Output impacts, which are the total value of product sales or services generated across the local economy, value added, employment income or labor income, as well as state, local, and federal tax revenue. So the first numeric column shows the average annual impact in 2019 US dollars for each of those metrics. The column to the right of that shows the total impact for the 10-year period modeled, which was 2021 to 2030. As you can see, there is robust positive benefit across all of these metrics, calling specific attention to the in excess of 10 billion output impacts seen over the 10-year period, as well as the 125 million in state and local tax revenue. We were also able to understand sector-specific economic impacts of a 15% carbon reduction standard. We see positive economic benefits across all impacted groups, including gasoline users, which is primarily households, diesel consumers, which most directly translates to trucking, electricity sales, as well as ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, RNG producers, and biofuel farmers. The column at the left again, or the first numeric column, shows the average annual impact across the 10-year period. So that's what you could expect to see on an average yearly basis. And the column at right provides the estimated total impact over that same period to all sectors. In conclusion, when we look at the economic impacts of a 15% carbon reduction standard through a clean fuels policy in Minnesota, we find net positive economic impacts in excess of 10 billion output impacts over the period modeled, and that includes benefits for gasoline fuel consumers or households and diesel consumers. We also saw those net positive impacts across all sectors, with consistent annual positive economic impact for the entire portfolio of fuels that we looked at, which included biofuels, other renewable alternative fuels, and electricity, all of which can be produced locally. So thank you, Mr. Chair and members. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Ms. White. Next, we will hear from Emily Wimberger with the Rhodium Group. Welcome to the committee.
Sorry, hello, good morning. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. My name is Emily Wimberger, and I'm an economist at Rhodium Group, which is an independent research firm whose analyses support decision makers in the public, corporate, and nonprofit sectors. Prior to joining Rhodium, I was the chief economist at the California Air Resources Board, where I worked across climate and air pollution policies, including the low carbon fuel standard in California. My comments today focus on a recent Rhodium Group analysis that highlights the need for a multi-pronged approach to reducing greenhouse gases in the U.S. transportation sector, an approach that includes vehicle electrification, efficiency, and low carbon liquid fuels. Transportation, as we've heard, is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., accounting for 33% of all emissions in 2019. Looking ahead, we project that 1.6 billion tons of greenhouse gases will come from transportation in 2030. In an analysis that we released in January, we identified transportation pathways to net zero emissions and found that a portfolio of strategies, again, including vehicle electrification across all modes, efficiency improvements, and low carbon fuels, is the lowest cost and most likely to succeed in reducing greenhouse gases, improving air quality, and promoting equitable access to clean transportation. Even with aggressive electrification, where more than half of all light-duty vehicle sales are electric by 2030 and nearly 90% by 2035, our analysis found that there are still 525 million tons of GHGs remaining in the US transportation sector in 2050, as outlined in this slide. Clean fuels will be needed to close this transportation emissions gap, specifically in hard-to-electrify modes like aviation and marine. Achieving net zero emissions in 2050 will require aggressive policies to deploy a portfolio of clean fuels, including durable market signals like low carbon or clean fuel standards. We find in our modeling that a combination of advanced biofuels, electrofuels, and carbon neutral fossil fuels can successfully close the transportation emissions gap. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll hear from Graham Noyes with the Low Carbon Fuel Coalition. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chair Long and committee members. My name is Graham Noyes. I'm the Executive Director of the Low Carbon Fuels Coalition. I'm pleased to advise this committee that we're at the beginning of the transition to low carbon fuels, and Minnesota stands in a strong position to benefit economically and in terms of jobs as part of that transition. We see major refineries, including Marathon, Holly Frontier, and Phillips 66, announcing the turnover of those refineries to renewable diesel production. And we see now, with almost 10 years of experience in California, a program with $3 billion in annual credit revenue that is not from appropriations, but is based on the greenhouse gas reductions of fuels, which have been in the neighborhood of 75 million metric tons to date. This attracts all industry sectors, whether it's solar and wind, renewable power sources, auto manufacturers, EV charging stations, EV manufacturers, ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, catalyst providers, technology providers. And because of this program structure, we see a technology neutral approach that uses the right technologies for the location. I appreciate the opportunity to present these remarks.
Thank you so much. Next, we will be hearing from Tim Rudnicki with the Minnesota Biofuels Association. Welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Tim Rudnicki. I do represent the Minnesota Biofuels Association, a nonprofit trade organization for ethanol producers. We support the Future Fuels Act for several reasons. Minnesota is a place with an abundant source of biomass, which can be used to produce homegrown energy for today and tomorrow. And in fact, the Governor's Council on Biofuels recognized the potential for Minnesota to harness this biomass potential and thereby be a national leader in producing a clean transportation fuel, such as renewable ethanol. And we think the Future Fuels Act holds tremendous potential to unleash a wide range of benefits by providing consumers with a cleaner and better value fuel. Furthermore, it would be a way to use the know-how of farmers to further green the supply chain. And lastly, deal with the expansion in reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in Minnesota's transportation sector. So we have some immediate solutions to a crisis situation, the climate crisis, and this is a great opportunity to take a significant positive step forward in addressing that problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Nels Paulson with Conservation Minnesota. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chair Long and members of the committee. My name is Nels Paulson, and I'm the Policy Director for Conservation Minnesota, a statewide environmental nonprofit organization with members in all 87 counties. Conservation Minnesota is excited to support the Future Fuels Act, and we are grateful to Representative Lippert for authoring legislation that will guide the next chapter for Minnesota's low-carbon transportation fuels. As we plan for new low-carbon transportation fuels, we are particularly pleased that the Future Fuels Act instructs the relevant agencies to consider the disproportionate burdens different communities face from transportation pollution, and then use that information to craft low-carbon fuel policies that will improve air quality and public health in burdened communities and across the state. We are also encouraged to see directives in the Future Fuels Act that will help protect natural lands, enhance environmental integrity, and to utilize low-carbon fuel policies to maximize the benefits to the environment and natural resources. Thank you for the opportunity to express Conservation Minnesota's support for the Future Fuels Act.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Steele Lorenz with the Farmers Business Network. Welcome to the committee.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. My name is Steele Lorenz, Head of Sustainable Business for Farmers Business Network, which is an agriculture technology platform designed to help growers evaluate and understand opportunities for improvement of return through agronomic and economic inputs. We have been involved in the program since the early days to help understand exactly how growers could participate in this, and the results are quite exciting. Our membership base in Minnesota alone is 2,641 farm enterprises, and we have been working with them to understand what their current carbon intensity score is and where there is opportunity for improvement. I'm proud to let this group know that Minnesota growers are in fact the second lowest in carbon intensity of all Midwestern states. And even with this incredible score, there is lots of room for improvement that could be incentivized through this Clean Fuel program. We expect that between 20 and 50% improvements can happen in feedstocks for biofuel across corn ethanol and renewable diesel through the improvement of nitrogen efficiency and the adoption of smart soil healthy technologies, including nitrogen inhibitors and practices including cover crops and reduction of tillage. The grower appeal here is quite strong, and many of our growers are asking for markets to be able to sell their low carbon grains into. But the importance here is the opt-in nature of this incentive program, as well as its alignment with healthy soil principles and practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Floyd Vergara with the National Biodiesel Board. Welcome to the committee. We have
Mr. Chair, Floyd announced he would not actually be available today. My apologies.
I hadn't gotten that notice. Then we will move to Josh Fisher with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Again, my name is Josh Fisher, and I'm here on behalf of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, and I want to thank the committee for the opportunity to testify today. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation represents the auto manufacturers that produce about 99% of all the light-duty vehicles sold in the U.S. We're here in support of the Clean Fuels policy and the implementation of a low-carbon fuel standard, or an LCFS, in the state of Minnesota. The LCFS is an important and necessary policy tool to support the state's goals to reduce transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions. The state is undertaking a number of efforts aimed at reducing GHG emissions because Minnesota has fallen short of its reduction goals. Auto Innovators wants to emphasize that the state needs a holistic approach that addresses all sectors and provides complementary measures to support emissions reductions and promote clean technologies. The LCFS is one critical piece of a comprehensive approach to transportation emissions. It makes sure that while automakers are making significant investments to the tune of $250 billion by 2023 into cleaner, more efficient, and electric vehicles, other industries will also be doing their part too. In this case, the fuels used in vehicles and other modes of transportation will also be reducing their carbon intensity as part of a lower carbon future for transportation. And as Minnesota seeks ways to fund electric vehicle investments, and LCFS can and should provide a revenue source for EV purchase incentives and charging and hydrogen fueling station development. We urge the committee to support this clean fuels policy, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. And our last testifier on Representative Lippert's list is Jeremy Martin with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Mr. Martin, welcome to the committee.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm the Director of Fuels Policy at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and on behalf of more than 6,800 UCS supporters in Minnesota, I'm enthusiastic in our support for the Future Fuels Act. The Future Fuels Act takes a science-based approach and measures each fuel based on its full life cycle emissions. This will drive technological development and deployment across a wide portfolio of low-carbon fuels, including electricity and biofuels. We know that we can't stabilize the climate with petroleum-based transportation fuel, but replacing petroleum is a big job, and it requires us to move beyond arguments about biofuels versus electricity and drive progress and deployment across all of the low-carbon fuel opportunities. By supporting emissions reductions rather than focusing on increased production, the Future Fuel Act also ensures that clean fuels keep getting cleaner. Electric cars and biofuels are cleaner than gasoline today, but we need electric cars powered primarily by renewable energy, and we need our biofuels to get steadily cleaner with less pollution on the farm and at the biorefinery, and the Future Fuels Act will support this progress. While the overall structure of the Act is technology neutral, each fuel pathway is different, and we need specific safeguards and policy guidance that's appropriate for each one. For supporting electrification, it's essential that we design this to benefit all Minnesotans, particularly those underserved and overburdened by today's transportation system. And we also need safeguards to protect natural lands and to ensure that support for farmers is equitable and benefits small and mid-sized farms as well. We look forward to continued engagement with the committee, the legislature, the coalition, and the administration to make the Future Fuels Act a success. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have one public testifier signed up, Peter Wagenius with the Sierra Club. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm Peter Wagenius from Sierra Club, and I am a member of the aforementioned STAC committee. At the heart of this proposal are two assumptions which are now out of date. First, advocates tout that it is technology neutral, which may have been a virtue at one time, but that is no longer a virtue when technologies are obviously not equal. Fully electric vehicles are superior in terms of climate impact as well as air quality and environmental justice. EVs are already significantly less polluting today based on the current electricity supply, which is already greener than in the past. This existing advantage for EVs will only grow as our electric grid continues to improve. By contrast, the other fuels already pollute more than electricity, and they always will. This is not to say there is no role for biofuels in transportation's future, but it should be limited to heavier vehicles where no electric alternative exists. Advocates have acknowledged that the biofuels industry wants this bill to carve out a place for them in the future of transportation. It is understandable they would need government to intervene on their behalf because technology and the free market, think General Motors, are currently passing them by. Policy needs to keep up with reality. Second, there is no need for additional rulemaking to accelerate adoption of EVs. That might be needed for reducing carbon in liquid fuels, but we don't need to overthink or bureaucratize EV policy. To accelerate EV adoption, we can incentivize charging stations, incentivize EV purchases, and implement clean cars. Could a low carbon fuel standard be an additional tool worth the time to develop? Theoretically, yes, if we could implement something very much like the California version, where they are in effect taxing big oil to pay for EVs. But it is unlikely that the Senate would ever pass, nor the Walz administration would implement that version of a standard. Let me end on a positive. To the extent that this bill serves as a possible alternative to the EV mandate, that is very useful, since ethanol, as currently manufactured, doesn't reduce carbon so much as move it around. It also pollutes drinking water and kills pollinators at great financial cost, all while distracting us from real action on the climate crisis. For that reason, Sierra Club is not opposed to this bill, but we are strongly expressing these concerns, and we thank the authors for bringing forth a possible alternative to the E15 mandate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wagenius. We will now turn to member questions, and we will begin with Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the testifiers. Thank you to Mr. Wagenius for his testimony as well. And I wanted just to point out, Mr. Chair and members, that we have also spent considerable time in the Transportation Committee this year talking about the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. And I've also very much appreciated Assistant Commissioner Sexton's role in guiding the STAC committee, which has been referenced several times. That's the Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council at MnDOT. And I think it's important, Mr. Chair and members, to note that this strategy, which is a good one, is part of a larger set of issues and recommendations. And I want to remind members that, in addition to lowering the carbon footprint of our transportation fuels, this needs to be done in conjunction with other strategies. I don't want people to be left with the impression that this is the only way to go. It's part of a larger mix, and that mix includes reducing vehicle miles traveled, land use changes that have tremendous import in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector, and of course, larger utilization of public transportation. So I hope it is noted that this is part of a larger strategy, and in fact, some of the other, and of course, electrification of the transportation system and cleaner cars, and that this is one of many tools we can use, and in fact, some of these others can have even greater impact than this. So, as we move forward, and I support this bill, Representative Lippert, and thank you for bringing it forward, and look forward to a conversation in the Transportation Committee about it. Let's keep in mind that this is part of one part of a much broader strategy. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Hornstein. Representative Swedzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to as far as, obviously tomorrow is our first deadline. And this bill, I believe, was put to Commerce. Am I correct?
Representative Lippert.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, Representative Swedzinski, it's going to Commerce.
Representative Swedzinski.
Well, is it going like today or tomorrow? I mean, technically we're not actually even, what was the motion that you made, Chair Long, on this bill?
Representative Swedzinski, this is an informational hearing. We don't have the possession of the bill. Representative Swedzinski.
So is it your thought that this bill will meet a deadline, Mr. Chair?
Yes, Representative Swedzinski.
It meets deadline how?
Because we are having an informational hearing and it is going to the Commerce Committee, which is a finance committee, and it will be referred to the Commerce Committee ahead of deadline. So it meets deadline.
So it's at committee. So not that it actually had a hearing.
That's correct. It needs to have a hearing before the second deadline in the Commerce Committee, which I understand it will.
But it needs to have a first hearing, and we're not having a hearing. We're having an informational conversation because we can't amend this bill currently.
Representative Swedzinski, the bill meets first deadline by being referred to a finance committee, and it is being referred to a finance committee.
Okay. Mr. Chair, and then I just have general questions.
Representative Swedzinski.
Thank you. So to the first testifier, they spoke to, I forget what your name is. I spoke to you yesterday, sir. You spoke a little bit that this is a better option than putting people from another state in charge of our climate goals. Was that a conversation about the California initiative? And then how does this bill interact with that potential moving forward through rulemaking through MPCA?
I'll direct
anyone that wants to
Mr.
answer that.
Mr. Jordan looks like wants to take a crack at that. Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chair and Representative Swedzinski, Brendan Jordan with the Great Plains Institute. There are clean fuel policies in other states, but the recommendation by the Future Fuels Coalition is to create a unique Minnesota version of this program. We can certainly learn from other states and other jurisdictions. That California is one of them, Oregon. There's also bills underway in New Mexico, Washington, New York State, the province of British Columbia. So there's a lot of models out there we can look at. But I just want to be clear that this is not binding Minnesota in any way to any other state's rules. This would be, if Minnesota finds something good that another state's done that we want to adopt, we're free to do so.
Representative Swedzinski, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, but how will this, just it can be to anyone, how will this react? So let's say for some reason, the state of Minnesota would move forward with the California mandates and what they do there by putting them in charge of our policies. How will this interact with that? These are two things that are moving forward. Chair Hornstein talked about this as just one part of a mix. How will this react with those other things that are potentially going to be happening?
Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chair, Representative Swedzinski, this has no connection with, I know the name sounds similar because it has clean at the beginning, but it really has no connection to clean cars. Clean cars is a whole separate thing. This is not related. It doesn't draw on, it's this connection with the Clean Air Act and California's regulatory authority. This would only, any authority to administer this would derive only from, Minnesota's own unique statutory authority.
One more question, Representative Swedzinski, and then we'll have to move on. We have several hands.
You had a lot of folks testify on the need for this from a scientific basis. And I've asked this question before. I've never gotten an answer back. If we pass this, one, how it will react to border communities. So like I represent a district along the border. And sometimes we'll buy fuel from Minnesota. Sometimes we'll buy fuel from South Dakota and have it trucked in just because of it's maybe a better deal across the border. How will this react potentially with border communities, with farmers, with purchasing fuel, with truckers? that might be just passing through the state from the petroleum retailers' perspective. And then also, we're told that this will not raise cost on fuels. So how does that work? I mean,
Representative Lippert, did you want to take that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Representative Swedzinski. Thinking in terms of agriculture, so, as an ethanol plant's drawing from farmers or contracting with farmers, one place where this policy would interact is, the ethanol plant might have the farmers within its area be implementing more soil health practices, leading to a cleaner score for its ethanol, and that might cross state lines. Otherwise, the focus of this policy is really just to drive cleaner and cleaner fuels, both drive cleaner fuels within biofuels and cleaner fuels within or towards more electrification as well. So it's focused on emissions, and that's a primary piece. And Brendan Jordan may have more to respond to your question.
Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chair, Representative Swedzinski, the challenge today with clean fuels is that there are massive barriers to entry in the marketplace. It's pretty common if you can find a gas station that sells, for example, higher blends of ethanol, you'll often find that the higher blends are quite a bit cheaper. But it's hard for consumers to access those things. That's true for a whole variety of cleaner fuels. I think that, to the extent that this helps support access to the market, I think you might have a border dynamic of people crossing the border to Minnesota to access the more, increased consumer availability of clean fuels in our state. From a retail perspective, I assume that people are still going to need to go to refueling stations, and so I think that this actually creates some opportunity for new investment and incentives for new investment in offering things like electric vehicle charging, higher blends of biofuels at those retailers. So I think it's a positive.
So we have 4 hands and we have just a few more minutes left. So if members could please keep their questions short and responses short, then hopefully we can get to everybody. Representative Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Chair Horson kind of mentioned this a little bit. I think this question is for Mr. Wagenius, who's identified himself as a member of the STAC. Could Mr. Wagenius explain what is the STAC and what were some of the other recommendations that they had? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure, Mr. Wagenius.
Thank you, Representative Lee, Mr. Chair. I am a member of the STAC. It made it consists of 17 people convened by Transportation Commissioner Kelleher and co-chaired by Chris Clark of Xcel Energy. It made 3 recommendations on reducing vehicle miles traveled, as well as 3 recommendations on repowering, each of which were approved as a package, 6 in total. I want to clarify that they were not ranked. Considerable concern was expressed about this proposal and its relationship to ethanol, but to vote no on it, STAC members would have had to also vote no on EV charging infrastructure and incentives to purchase EVs, which were very broadly supported. I'd be happy to speak to any of the other recommendations, but to reinforce Representative Hornstein's comment, I would call your attention to just one. The recommendation of the VMT group was that the state adopt a goal to reduce vehicle miles traveled by 20%. As much as you can hear that we are advocates of electrification, there is no data to support the idea that we could meet our goals in the transportation sector through electrification alone. Electrification alone should not be thought of as a silver bullet. Giving people alternatives, choices to get around so that they don't have to drive everywhere is an essential component to meeting our climate goals. Again, I'd be happy to speak to the other recommendations, and I hope that all 6 recommendations of the STAC are advanced by MnDOT to the legislature for thorough discussion.
Good topic for discussion for another hearing. Representative Gruenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the testifiers too. This is an interesting discussion. I have a ethanol plant in my district, by the way, and from all accounts that I've seen, it's run very well. But one of the concerns that they brought up, and they tend to be hassled by the MPCA quite a bit. They're not fans, but maybe nobody is a fan of the MPCA. is the groundwater effect. Now, I know the people who run the ethanol plants say they use much less groundwater than they used to, is the information I received. But it seems like the MPCA is very concerned about the overusage of groundwater to the point where we're depleting it in some areas, or the potential to deplete. Does any of the testifiers have an update on that in any way? I mean, where's the MPCA on that? Is the groundwater reserve and replenishing still a concern in terms of expanding the ethanol base in the state?
Representative Lippert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Gruenhagen. I know reuse of water, conservation of water is a topic of concern within the ethanol industry. I don't know if Brendan Jordan has a response to this or other testifiers.
Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chair and Representative, I might phone a friend here and ask if Mr. Rudnicki with the Minnesota Biofuels Association might have an answer to that question.
Mr. Rudnicki.
Mr. Chair, Representative Gruenhagen, I know that certainly inputs are used for making solar arrays and for producing petroleum and for making ethanol. And I think there are a number of statements that were made during this hearing that might need some further factual clarification. And without going into a lot of detail, but responding to the water question, typically what we see is the appropriation permits from the Department of Natural Resources, at least in the case of the producers I represent, are probably double what's actually used. And what's rather significant in the ethanol industry today, not 1990 or not 2000, but in 2021, is again, the producers I represent in the industry are really keen on reusing water. In fact, many of them are actually capturing storm water from their facility site and using that. The idea of reuse is key. And what's really significant here, Representative, is that there's a drive, and this clean fuels policy initiative can help even further advance technological innovation. The intent is to drive the carbon index lower. And as you heard from some of the subject matter experts here today, reducing inputs, greening the supply chain is how we make a cleaner fuel. And that actually has a better value for consumers. It's better for the environment because we're using fewer inputs. And again, this is, I think what some of the other representatives noted, Representative Hornstein, is that this is actually part of a solution to a very big problem. It's not the total solution, but any of us, if we just look out our window, we'll see lots of vehicles with internal combustion engines. The cleaner the fuel, the lower the carbon fuel, the better value for the consumer, and we begin reducing greenhouse gas emissions today. And the reality is this is how you deal with the rolling stock that's on the highway today. There's no question, if you walk, bike, use public transit, and then use a biofuel in your internal combustion engine, you're doing something significant today to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I'd be happy to provide more technical detail in written form if that would be helpful to you and the rest of the committee members.
So we're running, Representative Gruenhagen, we have two more questions and we're out of time. I was hoping to slip in the other two questions.
I just think the impact to our groundwater needs to be a mix in this discussion, okay? Because it is a concern. It's been brought up by other constituents in my area. And I think we need to use it in a way that it can be replenished. So I'm just throwing that out for food for thought. Okay,
thank you, Representative Gruenhagen. Representative Igo and Bo, if you could keep it to 30 seconds and one question, I can slip you in. Representative Igo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, my question was one that wasn't answered during the presentation. I'm hoping I can get a quick answer now. My district and my constituents, we love our 1990s pickups. We love our old two-stroke motors. We love our four-wheelers. We love our snowmobiles. These new fuels, these new ideas, they don't work in these older engines. And I guess my big concern is here is if we push forward a mandate like this, that we're going to see these fuels be unable to be used on these vehicles and these ATVs and these motors that me and my constituents love to enjoy, as well as the rest of greater Minnesota. And I think what we're going to have to do is going to force a future cost on my constituents that who are right now recovering from a pandemic that having to buy new motors or new vehicles is not what they want to do. They want to drive their 1990s F-150 that they can work on in their driveway. And I'm really afraid that a mandate like this policy would take that away from them. So that is my concern with this legislation. Thank you.
Representative Lippert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Igo. We're in a time of tremendous technological change, and it's really exciting. New technologies are emerging, and that has appeal. And we're going to see those technologies in more and more of our communities. And I think we do know we need to be transitioning towards electrification. Biofuels can help with that. Biofuels are able to be used broadly, and so I think we're going to see a part of this this policy is that it helps us with that transition, helps us speed that transition. So I think this can be part of the solution.
And I'd also just note, Representative Lippert, I believe this is a 20% requirement in 2035. So there's a lot of transition time, and it's not the entirety of the fuel stock.
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Representative Bo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had three questions. I'll go with one just because, like you say, time is tough. I did want to quickly say, Representative Igo, I hear you. I love muscle cars, and a lot of my friends do. And so, I worry about that. But my question is, what's the path for this bill? What is it going to be going through like environment and transportation, or what kind of committee? What's the path for that?
Representative Lippert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Representative Bo. It'll be have a hearing in Commerce, have a hearing in Transportation, for sure. So it's going to have a busy few weeks.
Thank you, Representative Lippert. So with that, Representative Lippert, any closing comments to your bill?
I just thank everyone for the discussion today. We need many policies to be addressing our climate